Chapter 29. 3 mice swelled Pax's belly, and a muskrat dangled from his mouth, his first large prey. It would feed Bristle and Runt for the whole day. He craved sleep after a long night of hunting, but as usual, he trotted a long, weaving path home to confuse any possible predators. The trail the bleeding Runt had left when they'd moved was still strong enough to mark them as vulnerable. The first rays of light lit the grasses. A movement caught his eye. Bristle. She was a few full bounds out in the clearing instead of at the apron of the burrow where she usually guarded Runt. He watched her bounce up in mock alarm and then tumble kicking into the grass. Then he saw an even more surprising sight. Runt's small head bobbed up. Runt was outside, and he was playing. Pax dropped the muskrat. He called for Bristle, and Runt turned his head. Pax called again, testing, and Runt answered. He could hear. Pax was washed with a relief so overwhelming that he could not move for a moment. Where he had once cared for only one boy, he now brimmed with love for this bristling vixen and her ragged brother, and they were safe. He streaked across the clearing. Bristle and Runt parted to welcome him in the space between them. He dropped onto his back, and Runt toppled onto him. Pax rolled Runt over gently, listening for any whimper of pain, and heard only purrs of delight. For an hour the foxes played. Runt rested often, and whatever he did, the other two stopped and flanked him. Like the buttercups beside them, their 3 fox faces lifted to the morning sun, until Bristle leaped to her feet, her nostrils flared. Pax smelled it too, the same threatening scent that had made him anxious for 2 days, but this was no longer a faint thread in the air. This odor was strong and growing stronger. Coyote! Bristle jumped toward the den, pivoted toward the clearing, then jumped back to Runt. Pax had never seen her so panicked. At that instant, all 3 foxes perked their ears sharply to the same spot in the woods, to the careless branch rustling of a creature that did not need the advantage of stealth. Heading north, up from the gorge, heading for the clearing. The coyote was following Runt's trail. Bristle nosed her brother upright and screamed at Pax, "Guard him!" Pax herded Runt back into the den, pacing the entrance. He watched Bristle head toward the rustling, stiff-legged and wary, and then stop. She pricked her ears, her rump high, and then in front of her, at the precise place where the junipers were still compressed from dragging Runt in, a dark, brindle coyote emerged, his head to the ground. Bristle barked. The coyote's head snapped up. Bristle barked again and jumped into the clearing. The coyote cocked his head and took a step forward, a step toward her. Then he lowered his nose to Runt's trail again. Deep instinct urged Pax to run away. The coyote was a tall, heavily muscled male. A fox was no match for an animal that large and aggressive. But a deeper instinct reminded him that Runt was defenseless in the burrow. Bristle ignored the instinct to flee as well. Instead, she tore straight toward the coyote, lunged at its flank. The coyote spun and snapped, just clipping Bristle's back foot. She limped into the clearing, whining as if she'd been injured. The coyote studied her, but then he shook himself, recognizing the ploy, and dropped the scent again. Bristle flew back. She jumped in front of the coyote's path and faced him, her spine arched. From her throat came a hoarse howl Pax had never heard before. For an instant, the coyote pulled back, seeming surprised that the small fox was engaging him. Then he bunched his shoulders into attack position and bared his teeth. Pax's body stiffened. A growl rattled in his throat. Runt whimpered in the den. The coyote sprang at Bristle and knocked her to the ground. For a moment, Pax saw nothing but fur and teeth flashing the grass and heard only yips and growls. But then Bristle scrambled out of the coyote's hold. She leaped again toward the center of the clearing, a single leap only. Pax understood she was luring him away from Runt. Staying just out of his reach, she baited the coyote until she reached the sweet gum tree. Then, just as Pax had done, she leaped up onto the slant of the trunk. She padded out onto the low first branch carefully, never taking her eyes off the growling coyote who followed on the ground. When she reached the spot where the branch split, she was well over his head. She hissed a taunt. The coyote jumped. He clawed only bark and leaves. He circled in the hollow under the branch, looking for higher ground, and then jumped again. This time his forepaws caught the branch and held for an instant before he fell back. He gathered himself and leaped again. Pax saw that Bristle was as far out on the limb as she could go. The coyote could tear her from the tree soon, or grow impatient with her distractions and return to the trail she diverted him from. She would follow and fight until he ripped her apart. "Stay," Pax ordered Runt as he tore across the clearing. Chapter 30, page 258. Peter stared. There'd been a birch tree by the upper walls of the mill. He and his friends had named it the pirate tree because in the fall, bright yellow leaves made it look covered in gold coins. He'd tied Pax to its trunk once when the kit hadn't liked their war play. The pirate tree was still standing, but now only blackened wisps tattered its branches. Nothing else, except the mill itself, was recognizable. All the trees in the lower field were gone, uprooted and blasted into splintered logs. Great patches of grasses around them were scorched to ash. The bank was littered with the crow-picked remains of perch and crayfish and turtles and frogs. What hurt most to look at was the water. The last time he'd been here, he dived into the pool at the base of the gorge. The water had been so sparkling and clear that he'd been able to see the pale green shafts of the reeds, the iridescent scales of the trout, and even, when he looked up, the sheer blue nets of dragonfly wings skimming the surface. He might have been swimming through liquid diamonds. Now, muddy boulders clogged the river, and the pool was a dull brown ring. The broad flat of the river was half its usual breadth. Mudflats near the banks, caking to dry clay, smelled of death. The water was what the whole war was about. Peter remembered Vola asking him which side his father was fighting on. Peter had answered her, stunned that she would even have to ask. "The right side," he'd added indignantly. "Boy," Vola had said, and then "boy," again, to make sure she had his attention. "Do you think anyone in the history of this world ever set out to fight for the wrong side?" The wind picked up and howled across the field, stirring eddies of ash. Peter tried to imagine playing here again. It would be a long time before anyone ever would want to play here. Vultures, wheeling silently above him, were the only living things as far as he could see. With this much devastation, they must have been feasting for days. He watched them, paralyzed by the sadness of the scene. The closest two were circling a hemlock bough near the bank, probably judging the safety of returning to the meal he had interrupted. A meal that might be... Peter couldn't form the thought, but he couldn't erase it either. If Pax had been here, he could be dead now. And if he was, the vultures would lead him to the proof. They hovered over 3 distinct spots, the one beside him and 2 across the river, slow and lazy. In no hurry, their meals weren't going anywhere. He dropped his pack. Freed of the weight, he swung down to the hemlock bough in a few steps, Trailing from beneath it was a sight he was dreading. A foxtail, its white tipped brush unmistakable. He lifted the limb. The fox carcass had been scavenged, but its pelt remained, and it wasn't red. It wasn't red. Not Pax. He took a ragged breath, dizzy with relief. He pegged down to the river and waded in. When he was waist high, the crutches skidded out on the mud-slimed stones, so he speared them over to the far bank and dived in. For the first time in almost 2 weeks, Peter didn't feel hampered by his broken foot. He swam strongly. He pulled himself onto the bank, out of water. The soaked cast felt like it weighed 100 pounds, the muddy plaster already crumbling. He took his knife out of his pocket and hacked at it until he freed his foot. It hung pale and limp, but the swelling was down and the bruise was almost gone. Peter crawled to his crutches and hitched them under his arms. Upright, he saw what the larger group of vultures was circling, the corpse of a deer. He thought of the doe he'd seen in Vola's field. "You humans, you ruin everything," and turned away from the sight. 20 yards up the field, a single vulture hovered over the third spot he'd sighted. Peter climbed, choosing a path where the grasses had been burned, easier going. At first, there seemed to be nothing on the charred ground. But when he was almost upon it, he saw a hind leg, fleshless and singed, but he still knew it was a hind leg, a slim, black-furred hind leg with a small white paw. A ragged drift of fur at the top was bright cinnamon. Fox. Peter swayed on his crutches. Maybe it wasn't Pax's. Wasn't it too small to be Pax's? He wished he could know. And then he took back the wish. What did it matter anyway? A fox had been going about its life here, and some humans had obliterated that life. Wasn't that enough of an outrage? He would scrape the earth with his bare hands and bury the remains. Peter dropped to the ground. He swept a circle bare of rubble, and his hand brushed something that turned the breath in his lungs to ash. A toy soldier, sighting down the barrel of a rifle pressed tight to its hard green cheek, aiming at whatever happened to be in the way. Peter kneeled over.